Today's readings juxtapose David's response to God with Mary's, and we can learn much from them. David has been a devoted servant of the Lord, and at this point has just become king over Israel. It hasn't been easy. He's had to deal with Saul, and then he had to fight with a number of other tribes, including a few of his own people, to consolidate power in Jerusalem. He celebrates this by building a royal palace of cedar to demonstrate both to his people and to the other kingdoms that he is here to stay. He thinks about how wonderful his life is compared to being the youngest child and a shepherd in the middle of nowhere. Had God not chosen him for greatness, he would still be living in a tent and herding sheep. He wants to demonstrate that he is God's and that God is his. So he thinks what God needs is a palace as good or better than his. He checks it out with his spiritual advisor, Nathan, who initially says, "Go for it. Everything else you've done has been blessed by God, so obviously this will be too." Poor David. He tries so hard to understand what God wants for him. And like most of us, he does fairly well until he starts thinking with his ego, trying to control and limit God. Remember that at this point, people are still worshiping at their altars in the high and holy places near them. Jerusalem is a big city, but most people have no need to go there. By making God a temple, he makes a statement that this is his God. That night, Nathan has a dream, and God tells him that David has missed the point entirely. This is not a God that can be encased in a building or limited to a kingdom or a king. I am a God that brought my people out of Egypt, and I am here to go with you wherever you go. It is not for you to build me a house. Instead, I will build of you a great house that will never die. It's like God tells David, don't be arrogant. You aren't the builder, I'm the builder. Even the things you build, I give you to build. David realizes that he misunderstood what God had meant for him. Doesn't help. His son Solomon will later build the temple anyway. People just can't help wanting to do their own will and forget who and what they're made for. After Solomon, there was one after another monarch who forgets that they owe all that they are to God, and each is worse than the rest, becoming bloated with their own power and poisoned by their own greed. God still keeps his promises, though. He doesn't get in the way of the consequences of their actions, but he is not the God of a monarch. He's a God of his people. David's line is no longer king of Jerusalem, but from him a king shall still spring. Many years later, we see the culmination of the promise of God to David. Mary is the betrothed of Joseph, of an inauspicious line of David. Joseph is not a king, but a man who expects to live a quiet life and make a home and a family with his own hands. Mary is a young woman at the crossroads. Between 12 and 14 years old, she is not yet married, but not a child anymore either. Vulnerable because she is in limbo between her identity as the child of her father and wife of her husband. Her life is about to change dramatically, and it would be natural for her to feel afraid of her future. When Gabriel appears to her saying that she is favored by the Lord, she has no idea what she's talking about. What could he mean that she is favored by the Lord? If she were a man, that might make more sense. But she isn't a man or wealthy or powerful, and she has nothing to be favored for. Gabriel tells her that she needs not be afraid. The life inside of her will fulfill the promises to David and will reign over the house of Jacob forever. Mary is a practical person and wants to know the mechanics of how this is going to work. Well, Gabriel does sort of explain, but points out that those are not the right questions because nothing is impossible for God. Mary doesn't question any further, though what she's been asked to do is far more difficult than anything David has been asked to do, as far as I'm concerned anyway. She just says, "Here I am, the servant of the Lord. Let it be with me according to your word." See, David thinks as a king. He's comfortable in his palace of cedar, with people who care for his every need and tell him that everything he thinks is absolutely wonderful. He looks at God through the eyes of his own experience, like most of us do, and believes that God needs what he believes he deserves. Nathan's initial response to David's idea of a temple shows that his people certainly thought that whatever he thought was going to be approved by God based on his previous successes. But David was wrong. God doesn't need the best house on the block. First and foremost, God is the salvation of his people. He isn't the same as other gods who protected a town or a harbor. He was not confined to a bush or to a mountaintop. God is everywhere his people are, whether they are in Jerusalem or Egypt or Babylonia. David was made king in order to serve God's people and provide safety and security, especially to its most vulnerable. It is not David's God, but Israel's God. When David remembers this, he is the King of Kings, leader of the nations, maker of psalms, and fulfiller of God's promises. When David forgets this, such as when he later sexually harasses Bathsheba and kills her husband out of lust and greed, he embodies the worst of all that what it means to be powerful. Instead of protecting his people, he confuses God's will with his own desires. Contrast this with Mary, whose life is moving from one uncertain situation to another. She has no opportunity to be comfortable, whether she is the unwed child mother of the King of Kings, having a baby in a stable, running for her life to Nazareth, trying to understand how to raise the son of a man, or watching him die a horrible death. In all of these things, Mary is trying to figure out how to be the best servant of the Lord according to his will. Rather than trying to fit God into her image, she is trying to fit into God's image, which is always more difficult. We all have a bit of David in us, wanting to serve God, but not seeing beyond our own ego as to what that might be. We think that God wants what we want in our time and our fashion. It can be easy to believe that it is our work that gives us what we have, and forget that everything is God's, and we are caretakers, not owners. We start to make an idol out of our own comfort and want God to speak to us words that give us comfort. But God generally doesn't ask us to be comfortable. Who would I be if I thought as Mary did, that it will be with me according to your will? Yes, I will serve God in my neighbor. Yes, I will help the stinky homeless man. Yes, I will see the face of God in the immigrant and the stranger. Rather than looking with fear at change, I would learn to see it as another opportunity to serve God in the world. I would learn to look beyond my security, to see the opportunities beyond my fear, and be the servant God wants me to be. Open your heart. Don't look at the world in fear, but with openness. See the uncertainty of life as Mary did. Be the heart and hands of God in the world, loving others as He loves us. The face of God in an illegal immigrant and an unwed mother reminds us that it is when we are most vulnerable that we are most in touch with God, in His humility, humanity, and divinity. Amen.